Tonight we have Dr. Eric Strauss, who is a research associate professor at Boston College. He's in the Department of Biology, although he actually interacts with our department because he's director of the Environmental Studies program at Boston College. And several departments, including the Department of Geology and Geophysics, Department of Biology, are part of the Environmental Studies program. Eric's probably his biggest claim to fame at BC is that he's the science director of what's called the Urban Ecology Institute at Boston College. And you'll hear a lot about that tonight because that's going to be the focus of tonight's presentation. Eric got a PhD in behavioral ecology at Tufts University and has been at BC for about a dozen years. Tonight he's going to be talking about the topic Urban Ecology, a new science for revitalizing America's cities. And I hope you'll all be revitalized by his presentation tonight. Eric.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I've been warned that this is sort of a rabble-rousing crowd, which is delightful. No. And you come with a reputation. It's delightful to be here, and I thank John and the folks here for inviting me. I've come out from the city, and we're going to talk a little bit about urban ecology, and that sounds, a little bit oxymoronic, like jumbo shrimp. And when I was an undergraduate preparing to do my graduate studies, and I ended up doing my doctoral studies with an endangered shorebird, the only students who were staying in the urban areas to do their work were those students who weren't funded to go somewhere else. Because as everybody knows, real ecology begins with a plane ride, and then increasingly more primitive forms of transportation until we end up getting off of an ox cart somewhere. And then we pick up our binoculars, and that's where the science begins. And we've learned a lot about ecology in doing those kinds of studies, but traditionally ecologists have really considered systems devoid of people. And in that sense, the science has not been in service to the largest community of people, which are those who live in cities. Nearly 75% of Americans live in urban areas. More than half the world's population live in cities. And that relationship is becoming even more intense. So as I began my teaching career at UMass Boston and then was recruited to Boston College to start an environmental program, it seemed to me that we had a rich ecological context. We had the highest densities of colleges and universities anywhere in the world in Boston, and yet very little of how Boston's urban ecosystem functions has been understood. And if we think about the incredible importance of having science that's in service to those who are of highest need, then we should be thinking about how the science of ecology can inform how we treat issues of sustainability in urban areas. And there was an important interdisciplinary urban meeting in 1990 in Calcutta. And part of the Charter of Calcutta emerged with the idea that we must cease seeing the city as a problem, and instead we must begin to think of the city as the solution with respect to environmental and social challenges. And when I talk to my students, they don't remember this, but you folks all do. The summer of 1969, when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire and burned on and off for 10 days. And you also probably remember that this was a time when color television was first arriving. And these images, both metaphorically and really burned bright in the eyes of the beholder. And in a sense, this was a death knell for our vision of cities, especially in the United States. For nearly 1,000 years, cities had been considered really the beacons of culture and learning and wealth all across the world. And yet, after World War II, we had a tremendous movement in this country, fueled by an increasingly wealthy and emerging middle class, that we will define success in the United States by going to school, getting good grades, all those kind of things, but then earning enough money to move out of the city and move into areas that we now call the suburbs. And we're going to talk about that phenomenon in just a moment. And it was images like this that reinforced the idea that cities in America were sites of decay and were sites of abandonment and were lacking the kind of social cohesion that we were hoping to build in our suburban communities. And I'm here tonight to talk on a number of different perspectives, but for us to really begin to think about this notion of urban areas as agents of the solutions for the kind of challenges that we're facing with respect to global climate change and environmental sustainability, which arguably are the most complex and challenging enigmas, if you will, that the generation that will follow us will have to solve. Because we really are in an arena where we are at the stage of a crisis. So I want to spend about an hour with you folks, and I encourage you to ask questions because I want this to be a dialogue and not a monologue. Talking about the nature of urban ecology, and I want to talk a little bit about the particular projects that we're involved with at Boston College as part of the Urban Ecology Institute. We're one of the 25 centers and institutes at the university. We have programs that involve education, community forest partnerships, and what we call a natural cities program. Our mission at the institute is to promote the stewardship of healthy urban ecosystems by improving science and civic education for middle and high school youth, and by working in urban neighborhoods to help restore their natural resources. Our focus is around urban neighborhoods, and our work involves, and all work involves, a theory of change. And our theory of change is that social and environmental well-being are inextricably linked. And unless we're able to bring together the natural sciences and the social sciences and community activists and issues around environmental justice and civil rights, and to bring all of those into a collective vision for healthy neighborhoods, we're not going to make the kind of transitions and transformations of these communities that are critical. And we're going to continue to see the kind of decay. And in some respects, the historical legacies that we've created at our universities, in some ways, exacerbate that problem. When John was kind enough to run down the litany of the things I do at the university, although I'm appointed within the Department of Biology, most of my work is with colleagues outside the department. And typically within universities, we're seated within our departments, we work within our departments, our consideration of our success is within these department perspectives. And yet, the problems that we face and the challenges that we should be addressing are probably so new there haven't been time for departments of these problems to develop. Climate change, environmental degradation, and the disenfranchisement of neighborhoods are probably the biggest challenges that we're going to face. But we don't have yet the entrenched institutions that are organized to work directly with these problems. So we need to be interdisciplinary, we need to be entrepreneurial, we need to think outside the box, we need to be willing to take risks. And the colleagues that I work with at the Urban Ecology Institute and through this larger collaborative across the country are extraordinary folks to work with. And I want to share some of that enthusiasm with you tonight, and also suggest how you can, as citizens, recognize the kind of stewardship role that you can play. I've already talked a little bit about why we should care about cities, why we should focus on cities through the lens of ecology. First of all, the majority of the world's population now live in cities. Worldwide, it's more than 50%. In the United States, it's over 2/3. And in the wealthier nations, this current pattern we have of exurban sprawl is the most ecologically damaging model we have for development. And when I say that statement, especially when I come out to gorgeous neighborhoods like Weston, I want to make sure that people understand that as an environmentalist, I don't enjoy the game of finger pointing. And when the model for suburban development emerged at the end of the Second World War, it wasn't like some people sat down in front of a drawing board and say, let's develop a way for humans to live that'll have the maximum negative impact on the environment. That's not what they did. Suburbia was a celebration of all that was extraordinary about this country at that time. The rise of the middle class, the GI Bill, low interest loans to have houses, the idea that every American could at some point afford a house. It's an extraordinary vision, and one that makes this country an extraordinary place to live. But what we've seen over time is that the way in which land is consumed in suburban development strategies are incredibly expensive to maintain. They're almost entirely reliant on the automobile for transportation. And yet they have none, or typically have none of the advantages that happen in rural living, which is where you take your water up from the ground, you use it, you filter it, and you put it right back into the same aquifer. That happens in rural systems. In urban areas, you have to import all your resources. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you generally have people living at high enough densities that your ecological footprints are constrained. You move to a model of exurban sprawl, you lose the advantages of the rural living and you lose the advantages associated with urban living. And you end up having an impact per person that's extraordinarily high. And it's unsustainable as a model for world development. I mean, that's the key thing. Why does it work in America? Because we're 5% of the world's population, we have 40% of the world's resources. We can make it work because we can pay the extraordinary cost of making it work. But it's not an exportable model.
How do you define a city?
We use the general U.S. Census tract data, and I can provide that information for you. It's a pretty, it's a particular formula that they use. So.
Population.
Yeah, it's population density per area. The quality and character of the urban landscape is how people view nature. If most people are living in cities and most young people are growing up in urban areas, how we care for the cities and how we care for open space in the city is defining to them the role that humans play in the environment. It's not good enough to take young people on a meaningful experience and take them out to an area that is pristine and then bring them back to the city. It's a subtle or even not so subtle way of saying, you know what, where you live really stinks. What you need to do is stay in school, make enough money, and then you can afford to move on out to someplace that's better. As opposed to empowering people to love the neighborhoods they're in and saying, I can take a role in transforming the neighborhood. And that's one of the revelations about urban ecology is that we don't think of cities as a collective whole. We think of them as neighborhoods. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. We're going to talk about the notion of social cohesion and the kind of forces that make for healthy neighborhoods. By focusing our research efforts on urban ecology, cities can become more livable and we can begin to remove the pressure that exists on the remaining open space that we have. I'm not here saying that open space isn't precious. It's absolutely critical. But the current model we have of consuming open space, if we keep going the way we are now, there isn't going to be much open space left in the next 75 years. And also, and this is one of the things that I'm most hopeful about, is that the nature of cities and their challenges can be understood from an ecological perspective. So many of our urban challenges have been so deeply politicized that somehow they become red or blue issues. You know, since when does healthy air and healthy water and freedom from asthma and other types of environmental insults have to have a political label? If we can reapproach these issues from an ecological standpoint, we can get a timeout, if you will, from the kinds of political fights that have been happening around urban challenges as they have been recast over the past 100 years, and begin to think of them from a more politically neutral perspective, where we can begin to make some inroads. Where are you? There you are. You know, when I was growing up, the poster child for the giant city was Hong Kong, and I don't know how many of you have had a chance to go to Hong Kong. I had a colleague who just came back last week and brought me lots of fresh photographs that because of the constraints in our time tonight, I don't have time to show you. But you know, this used to be considered one of the world's biggest cities and most densely populated cities. It has 10 million residents on what amount to about 1,000 little islands. But it's reached the most build out it can get. They can't build the buildings any higher because they sink into the ocean. So they've really reached the maximum. And so a city of 10 million doesn't even make the top 15 anymore. The biggest megacities in the world now have at least 15 million people. Some of them have at least 20 million people. And of the top 15 urban centers, 8 are in emerging nations. So if you think we have a challenge managing our urban resource base, imagine what it's like in Mumbai or Sao Paulo or Beijing or Calcutta as these people try and deal with these kinds of development. You know, as a nation, we're losing a leadership role in so many branches of technology, whether it's stem cell research or whether it's software design, but we have an opportunity to be a beacon of hope and technological advancement for how we can build healthy cities. We know what the challenge is like. Here's the ecological footprint of the city, if you will, the urban footprint of Baltimore and Washington, D.C., as it was in the just antebellum period in the United States. And here is what that city footprint looks like 100 years later as the urban area has grown. And any of you who have flown in an airplane down the East Coast know that basically from Portland, Maine to somewhere south of Virginia, if you're not passing over water, you're over a city. It's the megalopolis. And here are some really stunning data. And the fellow who provided these data for me has just come out with a new book, which I wanted to get a copy so that you guys could see it. Here are some data on population and land use change over a 20-year period of time from 1970 to 1990. And some of these older cities like Chicago grew only by about 4%, but their land use grew by 50% in that period of time, the size of the city. Los Angeles, you know, the poster child for sprawl, increased its population by 50%, increased its land use by 300% in that period of time. New York City, 8% growth, but 65% increase in land use. Seattle growing by a third, the fastest growing city in this sample per capita, but more than doubled the rate of land use compared to the rate of growth. And some of this is a result of an increased wealth per capita and the ability to acquire more land. But it is also a function of how we're valuing land and how we're clustering the way in which people live. And although we don't have as much time as I'd like tonight to talk about some of the social impacts, many of the great visions of what life in the suburbs would be like has not been realized. The kind of village connections that were hopeful. You know, most of suburbia are strip malls in which people are even less likely to know who their neighbors are than if they live in the city. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. We know that associated with urbanization and the incredible technological revolution that's happened in North America has come at some cost. And we could pick any one of the things to measure. This happens to be greenhouse gas emissions. And we now have data that go back almost 400,000 years. But we're seeing an extraordinary peak in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the initiation of the petroleum era. And we've seen nothing like it in the Earth's history. And here's where I want to make, I think, one of the more challenging working assumptions about cities. And many academics who are working in urban ecology now would argue that actually we are all urban dwellers. And let me help to formulate that thesis a little bit more richly, and we can chew on it maybe during a question period at the end. Here's an image from some trees, spruce and fir trees that have been devastated by acid rain that has been produced from Rust Belt cities that were 1,000 miles away. And when we talk about the reach of cities, the city boundaries, the physical and political city boundaries are not the ecological boundaries that happen when we talk about cities. So not only did the pollution from these cities reach this mountainside, but so did the products of the cities. The products that the people are using in this community typically were probably not produced in that community. They're driving the cars that were built in the Rust Belt. They're using the technology. Or they're farmers producing food that gets shipped back into the city. You know, if you decided to have an orange or orange juice this morning, that orange wasn't produced here in Massachusetts, most likely, unless you have your own greenhouse. It came from California or Florida or Brazil, or more likely some of the emerging big orange growers, Iran, Turkey, Israel. They're finding out how incredibly profitable it is to sell oranges to the United States. Because we'll drink it in the form of juice, which is 3 times more expensive than eating the orange itself, and you get to use more of the oranges. So we have this kind of exchange of goods and services that reach way outside the boundaries of what we traditionally consider our industrial cities. And in that sense, we are all urban dwellers. And we'll come back to that. Let's take a moment to ponder what an ecosystem is. Because when we talk about cities, it gets a little bit more complicated because of the addition, the huge impact that humans have in shaping the ecosystem. When we think about ecosystems, we think much more romantically about a coral atoll in Micronesia. And there we see the saltwater, and we see the freshwater lagoon, and we see the freshwater habitat that's made possible by the corals, and we can have a sense of the boundaries of what it means to look at an ecosystem. I mean, all the organisms there make up that community. That community comprises a habitat, and the two together are considered the ecosystem. And the critical issue when we think of ecosystems is related to scale. And that scale is incredibly variable depending upon the question we're asking. And an ecosystem is entirely dependent upon the organism that's being considered. So if we're thinking about the mites that live off the oil secreted by the hairs that come out of your eyelashes, that come out of your eyelids, their world is entirely the base of that hair shaft. But if we're thinking about the sands of this ecosystem, if you were to take a shovel full of this sand, you would find radioactive fallout. You would find all kinds of chemicals that weren't produced here, but they were carried through the wind. I mean, you all remember the Chernobyl incident. We're about 20 years out from that event. There was a sense of us that, oh, it was horrible for the people in Europe, but we're safe. What was it, 10 or 12 days after the event, the farmers in Vermont were pouring out their milk because of the radioactive fallout that had landed on the grass. You know, and here's a state that is famous for its organic farming. Ben and Jerry's destroying their ice cream because of the impact. So this notion of globalism only enhances the importance of thinking hard about getting cities right. Because if a city isn't right, one of these megacities isn't right anywhere in the world, it's going to have an impact on us, even if we don't want it to have an impact. And when we think about urban settings, humans dominate the landscape, but just like every other organism, they're struggling to survive in an environment where resources are patchily distributed. And we see that all the time in other animal systems, in human systems. Here we see in the Boston Public Garden, we have a homeless person sitting on the bench next to one of the most expensive hotels in the city. Huge variation in the resource base of this person sitting here and that person sitting in there. But I said, I'm not coming here as a politician, I'm not using this as a lever. I'm talking about it from an ecological perspective. So when we begin to think about how we bring what appears to be a disparate strategic approach of thinking ecologically about human-dominated ecosystems, we need to begin to accept the role that we have as an integrated species within a system. And we have incredible power because of our ability to manipulate the environment and manipulate technology. So urban ecology is a blending of scientific approaches and cultures. The shape and dynamics of cities are the result of physical, biological, and social forces. And as my colleague Morgan Grove, who works for the U.S. Forest Service and recently won a Presidential Young Investigators Award. He's a social scientist working for the Forest Service studying urban ecology. I mean, talk about sort of an oxymoronic notion. But the Forest Service gets it, man. They get it big time. Because you know what? East of the Mississippi, it ain't about the trees lying sideways on the truck. It's about the trees standing upright in the cities that people are concerned about. And so he works out of the Northeast Research Station, and he's fascinated and focused on the role that urban forestry has in maintaining social cohesion. because those standing trees in cities are as equally as important as the board lumber is that builds the houses, because of the role that trees play in cleaning the environment, shading the environment, modulating the temperature, and creating places that people want to live. So he points out that humans, like every other species, are not exempt from physical, chemical, or biological forces, and they're shaped by the force of evolution. We exhibit social and cultural behavior, and those social and cultural traits are fundamental responses of humans to their environment. He's saying, look, we can't separate this. So we take this back to a scholarly level. We can't separate the social sciences and natural sciences. Not if we're going to try and do work that's in service to communities of need. And so in an effort not to put everyone to sleep, we won't stay on this slide for very much longer. We'll just have you memorizing it. We'll do a blue book final at the end. So if we were to take this word, the city, away and put up instead that coral atoll, we would think about the standard biogeophysical drivers that are responsible for making those ecosystems work. The flow of energy, the cycling of matter, the community composition of the species that live there, which lead then to issues of primary production and population and organic material and nutrients and disturbance. That's what makes the system work. But in human-dominated landscapes, the socioeconomic drivers, like the flow of information among humans, the cultural values and perceptions, those institutions and organizations which give rise to the patterns of human activity like demography and economic patterns and power hierarchies and the designed environment, have just as much an impact on the ecological sustainability of the city as do these biogeophysical drivers. And if these two communities don't talk to each other, and more importantly, don't recognize the residents of cities as stakeholders in this conversation, then sadly, and I use the term pejoratively, this whole process will be an academic exercise and not ultimately be in service to communities. So thinking about cities or thinking about a synthesis of ecological process, biodiversity issues, population biology, public health, evolution, and of course this great challenge of scale. And by the way, anyone who's interested in getting a copy of this PowerPoint can just email me, and the email information is at the end. So if you're a teacher, you want to use this, we'll send it to you, so you can use it with your students. There's at least 3,000 students across the city of Boston who are now taking urban ecology courses, and we're writing a textbook for this, which will be the first of its kind. Let's talk specifically about a couple of projects. We're going to talk about an urban forestry project, and we're going to talk about some of our educational research programs, so you can get an idea of how we bring these ideas together. The Urban Ecology Institute is the lead institution on a group called the Urban Forest Coalition. And within this coalition, we're working on issues of public awareness and advocacy, research and strategic planning around green space in cities, and urban forest inventories. From the social sciences all the way through to the natural sciences, it might surprise you, but probably not, that prior to about a year and a half ago, we didn't know how many trees there were in the city of Boston. City of Brookline thought there were 3 times more than they actually had when we actually went and counted them, but nobody really had an idea. And remember, this is a city that has the highest density of colleges and universities of any city in the world. So we have the most privilege with respect to data gathering. Really no idea how many trees we have. City of Boston has 1 forester to manage the city of Boston. And basically their team comes out when something falls on top of a car. So what we decided to do about 3 years ago was to engage the local community in an urban forest inventory, the so-called GBUFI, Greater Boston Urban Forest Industry. It's state-of-the-art. It's a GIS-based inventory of the urban forest in Greater Boston that includes a detailed inventory of all the street trees and remote sensing analysis of the overall canopy. Yeah? Yes, graphical information systems. It's the ability to digitize maps so you can create layers, and you also use satellite tracking systems to truth your locations. You'll see as an example when I show you some of the maps. So, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, but here's a huge project. No university is going to take it on because it's going to take too many person hours to accomplish. There won't be enough publications related to it. So it's a project that's incredibly useful as a community-based project because it allows people to take some control in their own neighborhoods. And when you want to stand up for issues of environmental justice, it's valuable to argue about issues of fairness, but boy, is it more powerful when you can argue with data. So we had schools doing these inventories, we had community groups, we had volunteers like yourselves, we had people as young as 9 years of age, people as old as people in their late 80s. It was used handheld computers, and every tree was located with satellite technology, its health, its species, its age, its height, particular disease status. And it allowed us then to create these digitized maps of neighborhoods, this one being in Roxbury, one of the poor communities in Boston. They have a total of 2,064 trees, 71 of which were dead, 298 empty tree pits that had not been filled. And we know, not only do we know the exact locations of every tree, every one of those dots represents a tree of which we have about 100 data points on each tree. Yeah.
Is that mission called Nipper Left?
Yes.
For that high observation?
Exactly. Excuse me. So we have very detailed here, this happens to be from East Boston. We know the individual species identity of the communities of trees. We have information related to their condition. In East Boston, there are a little over 2,200 trees, of which 44 are dead, over 200 empty tree pits. About 2/3 of the trees are in good condition. That's actually good news. By the way, this effort is now being recreated in Los Angeles, where they're starting to do an analysis. And they have a huge problem there because they planted all these palms to make Los Angeles look like Los Angeles. Of course, the palms aren't actually native to North America, and so they don't last very long and they don't do what you're supposed to do. So
if you had someone as young as 9 or as old as 88 going out and doing this, how would they be able to identify the specific species of trees?
that's a great question. So how do you take people who are, let me paraphrase, who are not then yet experts in what you're asking them to do? You have workshops. And we ran over a dozen different workshops. You have them go out in teams. You have members from the university go with them. And then the folks, some of the folks become team leaders and they can form new groups. You have them take leaf samples when possible. You take digital photographs of the trees, and anything that is difficult to identify the species, you send an expert out to do it. Yeah.
I just want to say that sounds to me like you, by making people more aware of the trees around them, they're almost more proprietary towards them.
You're absolutely hitting this
They
right.
care, and the little kids.
The two things that happen that have the most social value, and not necessarily ecological value, but social value, is that people working in these groups get to know their neighborhoods, they become less afraid of their neighborhoods, and they know their neighbor's name. And if we have time, we'll talk about that, and someone could bring that up in a question. There have been some very interesting social research done on the role of cohesion in neighborhoods. And it turns out that whether neighborhoods are wealthy or impoverished, the social cohesion is based upon individual knowledge and networks.
But at the same time, they're caring, the kids are learning to care about the
That's
trees.
right.
They're less likely to
In their
harm
own
them.
neighborhoods. And so some of these trees are getting named by students, just like the coyotes that our students are studying. So we get incredibly detailed data. Here are the various neighborhoods of Boston. And again, you can't, most of the folks in the back room probably can't even see this. But what you do see is there's existing tree cover, and these data are gathered using software called the Forest Opportunity Spectrum, which allows us to do sophisticated analysis of satellite images. So overall, Boston's tree cover is about 29%. There's about 30% of the area that's impervious and wouldn't be suitable. But our target goal is that we could reach about 41% tree cover if we chose to do that. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a moment. And there's actually a couple of more slides here.
That'd be an additional 41%, correct?
No, that would be to reach a total of 41%.
What is tree cover, area?
Tree cover is, the easiest way to define that is if you were looking out of an airplane at 30,000 feet, the part that you saw that was covered by the tree canopies.
Oh, it's an area.
It's an area. So for instance, we've done analysis of the existing tree cover using another software program called City Green, which we're also training high school and college kids to use in the city. And it can measure the dollar value impact of the trees that we have in the city. So the dollar value impact is measured by the removal of things like carbon monoxide, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and also carbon sequestration, suggests that on an annual basis, the ecological services provided by the existing urban tree cover is about $2 million a year. Because having trees in your city is not free. They have to be pruned, they have to be cared for. Sometimes they fall down and people get hurt and sue the city. And so when it comes to managing trees, we have to have some kind of economic basis by which we measure the efficacy of those trees.
Is each tree given a special number?
Yes, yes, and tracked. So looking ahead for our strategic planning, we're working with community groups to set urban tree cover goals. From an environmental justice perspective, each neighborhood ought to have its maximum achievable tree cover. We know that as you increase tree cover, you reduce the heat island effect of cities, which is a way to modulate climate change, and we have very, very positive impacts on air quality. And then another more neighborhood-focused part of this is a program we call City Roots, where we work with local neighborhoods to plant trees and transform vacant lots in urban areas. And so far we've done about 100 vacant lots across the city. And measured by the total number of trees you plant, it's a relatively small number. We've planted about 104 trees, of which only 2 have died in the past 3 years. But in the context of how it transforms neighborhoods, it has a much, much greater effect.
Question?
Yeah,
Has your survey only been of the public areas like streets?
that's a great question. When we talk about street trees, we're talking about those trees that are not in parks, but are growing alongside public ways. So Boston has about 30,000 street trees.
So is that part of encouragement and tax incentives to owners of private land to put trees in there?
Yes, at least it's happening slowly. You know, insurance companies feel much better when you cut the trees down around your house, even though that can increase your energy use by 1/3. You know, it's amazing. I mean, deciduous trees do wonderful things for you. They have these leaves that absorb all this heat in the summer when you don't want the sun to strike your house, and then the leaves fall and let the sunlight through during the winter months, and yet they always break the wind. And you know, they're just extraordinary in their ability to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels within our homes. And yet we, you know, yes, I'm sorry.
If you undercount, if you're not counting the parks, haven't you really undercounted a lot in Boston?
When we do, we're counting, so as far as knowing individual trees, yes. The urban forest cover analysis measures everything.
That's the 28%.
Yeah, the 29% is that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. The 29% represents total tree cover, and that's taken from satellite imagery.
But the 30,000
Are the individual street trees.
does not include, yeah.
That doesn't include all the trees in the parks. So let's take a look at an educational role in the few minutes that we have left. And you might pose a question, how does urban ecology relate to public education? And we argue that public schools are poised to contribute to science in ways that most universities can't. And I've alluded to this in the beginning when I said that typically the kind of long-term commitments necessary for ecological change are not the kind of studies that universities get involved with. You know, most of our research is done in collaboration with our graduate students. And if you're talking about baking a graduate student in the oven, they take 3 years to make a master's student and about 5 years to make a PhD student. And so you want projects that are 3 years or 5 years in length. And that works well for certain kinds of research. But the challenge is that when we're trying to sort out the variability in ecological systems, 3 and 5 year windows don't give us much insight into the nature of ecological systems. Now, the National Science Foundation has begun to recognize that. They're now funding across the world 30 long-term ecological sites that are expected to go 50 years. And 2 of them are in cities. One's in Baltimore, one's in Arizona, and Phoenix, and we work closely with those folks. But we're trying hard to find ways to recreate some of those protocols and answer some of those questions without spending the kind of money that those cities are doing. And so we think that students can make meaningful contributions to science because repetitive studies are advantageous to school systems. So a school system invests in training their teachers to be involved with this kind of science. They don't want it to end in 3 years. They want to be able to have a whole generation of teachers contributing to this kind of research. It was the model behind the Massachusetts Biodiversity Days, which lasted some number of years until the funding at the state level dried up. Here are just some data, the data of which are not that important, but this is part of the doctoral research I did on the reproductive success of piping plovers, an endangered shorebird that lives down in the Cape. We ended up doing this study for 20 years. I was at 4 different universities while that work was being done. Some years we had funding, some years we didn't, but we had community groups and high school kids committed to the work. So we were always able to gather the research data. When we had big grant years, boy, those are years we bought research trucks, we bought cameras, we bought spotting scopes, binoculars, the things we needed. Years we didn't have a lot of funding, well, we needed gas to run the vehicles, but we had the equipment. So we could do long-term studies. And so I'm a big believer in the involvement of the community. One, it adds to the efficacy of the work that's being done, but I think more importantly, it gives the community a sense of the role that they can play. So in 1998, when I was approached by a couple of environmental lawyers, one was Charlie Lord, who is currently the executive director of the Urban Ecology Institute. One was Max Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy's youngest son. Both of them had been lawyers and working in impoverished communities and were frustrated by the lack of opportunities for young people. And I had just written a successful biology textbook and had a television series that had been launched on ecological systems. And we were introduced by a colleague, and the 3 of us were thinking, maybe we could take this model and make it work in a city. And we convinced our dean at the time, Robert Barth, to allow us to start this institute, the Urban Ecology Institute, and allow us to raise funds extramurally for this institute that would be dedicated to transforming urban communities. And that was 8 years ago now. And you know, as they say, the rest is sort of history. But this model that we developed began with an education program that felt that we could help change the way science was being taught, especially in urban areas, by bringing in open-ended questions and by bringing in long-term field studies that would be linked to classrooms in the 6th through the 12th grade, in both in-school and after-school components. We currently have over 3,000 students in the metro Boston area who are working on this project. They're collecting and analyzing data. They're reporting and presenting at meetings.
Has MCAS come into this?
Oh yes, I'm going to get to that in just a moment, because you got to be smart about this stuff. Our service that we provide to teachers involves training and workshops, curriculum materials, field support from AmeriCorps Vista, funding for equipment and transportation, summer graduate institutes that I teach at the Urban Ecology Institute, field-based consulting from our staff, a mid-year annual student conference, and a conference at the end of the year. And we achieve this through a community and university partnership. You know, I'm here just representing many people who are committed to this, including folks here in the geology and geophysics program. Alan Kafka has been a wonderful contributor to this program, as have been great folks at the Lynch School of Education like Mike Barnett and Kate McNeil. And we've been fortunate enough to receive 4 major grants from the National Science Foundation that have helped to jumpstart this program. And so you ask the question, you know, what does it do for us? And I'm going to jump ahead here, given the time, and go right to program assessment. We've assessed our program on its impact on students measured with respect to 3 themes: their increased intellectual and social self-confidence, their understanding of the scientific method, and increased stewardship and civic leadership. Our assessment methods include a science attitude inventory survey, teacher interviews, student focus group interviews, and analysis of annual student research conference presentations. And we're delighted to report that we're having a positive impact. If we take a look at the students who are involved in our program and measure their self-confidence with respect to school versus control students, our students show a marked increase in self-confidence having participated in our program. Control students in pre and post assessments show no change. With respect to interest in science, students who participate in our program, both males and females, show a dramatic increase in science, while typically what happens in public schools is student interest in science declines over the years. And in civic responsibility, our students show a significant increase. And let me remind you, or at least introduce the idea, that our programs are not targeted at the talented and gifted students. We're working in the schools that have the highest amount of need. You know, when we first started the Urban Ecology Institute, we had lots of very talented teachers coming from wealthier school districts who we were glad to have working with us. But it's sort of interesting, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're great teachers from great school districts, and strangely enough, they do well with their students. They would do well with our students if we left them alone. And so it was clear from our mandate from the dean at the university and from our board of directors that we need to be working with those schools that were showing the lowest MCAS scores and those teachers that were having the most challenges in their classroom. And so we began by around 1999, 2000 to focus on those schools, and that's almost entirely our focus now. Other teachers are welcome to come to our workshops and things like that, and we're happy to provide the curriculum, but our daily input into those schools is limited to those schools of the highest need. I want to finish by just talking about one other study that we're doing that I think is kind of interesting. And it has to do with the impact of urbanization and changes in land use. As you probably are all aware, especially living in Weston, you have coyotes as neighbors. And if you've lived in Weston long enough, you'll remember a time when you did not have coyotes as neighbors. Although the Pilgrims make reference to a brush wolf that they were hunting and using their pelts from. And those were probably the larger eastern coyotes. Our team has been studying coyotes down on Cape Cod for almost 15 years, and one of the more radical ideas that we hatched was that maybe we could move this coyote study into the urban context, and we could get high school students actually to be studying coyotes. I mean, you want to talk about what they call a charismatic megafauna that generates opinions and emotional responses. As one of the biochemists who sat on my PhD examining committee told me, she said, when it comes to science, especially ecology, Eric, there will be a lot more known than is actually true. And when it comes to coyotes, it's absolutely amazing. As I say to students, coyotes are just the classic last immigrant group to get to Boston. And so they are blamed for everything that goes wrong. There are a lot of cats that get, that disappear in the city of Boston. But you know what? There are still cars on the roads, and there are still people picking up cats for pets. But you lose your cat, and it's automatically to a coyote. And it's funny because, I do a lot of talks about coyotes around the city, and someone will come to me and say, my cat was eaten by a coyote. What are we going to do? I said, what evidence do you have that your cat was eaten by a coyote? It didn't come back. And I said, well, yes, I mean, it's certainly possible if coyotes are there, but we go through a lot of coyote droppings, and we don't find as much cat hair as you folks would think that we would be finding. So we initiated a coyote study in the urban context. I mean, coyotes are an integral part of human history in North America. There's strong linkages to both Native American cultures and Western expansion. And I think of the recent movement of coyotes east as a classic immigrant tale. And really very little is known about coyotes that live close to people, especially in cities. The Urban Ecology Institute coyote study is the first to examine the role of suburban and urban coyote ecology in the Northeast. And the long-term nature of the research fits into the model of how we do our studies.
How is it that these kids are able to actually be cradling coyotes?
It's anesthetized. I'm sorry, I'll get to that.
Fine.
This one's not. I'm going to show you some video footage when we're done of the pups we raised by hand. This is one of our hand-reared pups.
Okay.
This is John Way, who just finished his doctoral thesis at BC and is now teaching full-time at high school, committing to the needs of high school students as he does his postdoctoral research with us. The objectives of our study in the urban area is to describe their home ranges and group sizes and movements. We're interested in how these activity patterns of our Cape Cod study, which is more rural, compare to the urban coyotes in the Boston metropolitan area. And we also have a study on a captive population at the Stone Zoo.
Question, can they interbreed with your dog?
They could, they can. And there's some evidence that they occasionally do. The genetic analysis that we've been doing of our coyotes indicate that there are both wolf and dog genes in the coyotes, which may help to explain why coyotes on the East Coast are weighing 40 and 50 pounds, where coyotes in the American Southwest are weighing 25 and 30 pounds.
I've never heard of coyotes in the city, but I believe you.
Oh, they're everywhere. They really are. We have a collared pair that are living at the Fleet Center. And in fact, one of their offspring, who is wearing a collar, when he dispersed to Rhode Island. Moved almost 100 miles. But they can move 10 or 12 miles in a given night. We have students doing radio telemetry studies, and these dots represent individual radio locations. And we can use those individual data to develop home range models for individual coyotes. These are data from Cape Cod. And you can see that the home range sizes vary pretty dramatically. And we can talk about some of those reasons. Here's why you don't see coyotes. Here's when you're awake, from like 6 in the morning until around 10 o'clock at night. And here's when the coyotes are active. So they do the swing shift. So we're diurnal for the most part, and they're nocturnal for the most part. The times that you see coyotes during the day are periods of time when either young are dispersing, and they tend to be making mistakes by being out during the day, and in narrow windows of time when the young are just finished weaning and they're still growing really fast, and so they need so much protein that the parents have to hunt 24 hours a day in order to serve the needs of the offspring.
Do they attack people?
There have been a total of 6 incidents in Massachusetts since we've been keeping data of human-coyote interactions that ended up in violence. They usually result in somebody being bitten. In 3 of those instances, the coyotes were rabid, which sort of puts them into the rabid animal category, which is sort of a different issue. In the other instances, they have been associated where a dog and a coyote have been fighting, and the people try and get in the middle to split them apart, or there's a coyote on the deck eating the cat food, and they try and get the food away from them. So there's some very simple things you can do that if you have ever lived with wild animals, mistakes you don't make, like leaving food resources around, and then you just don't have incidences with them, because they are, for the most part, very curious, but they are not, for the most part, particularly violent. I want to end the formal part of the conversation here because I want to leave some time for conversations. You can visit us at our website at www.urbaneco.org. You can go to the Boston College Environmental Studies site. You can send me an email. You can call me on the phone. I even open letters and answer snail mail. And I want to thank you folks for joining us tonight. I want to end by showing you a little bit of footage of some coyotes from our study area.
Ms. Cat and Cat.
How large are their litters?
They usually have somewhere in the vicinity of of about 4 to 7 pups. So here's a typical coyote as it is encountering a busy road. Oh, no, 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 no. Where? Oh, come on, you got to be up here. There we go. This is a coyote in a suburban neighborhood. It's sort of next to a road. Casper was hunting for her pups during the day. She doesn't really want to cross that road during the day because it's too busy. So she's going to go back around. She eventually did cross the road. But people just don't end up seeing them. Here's a coyote that we captured, put a radio collar on, about to release her. And we generally do the releasing right about at the end of the day. We capture them. They tend to be captured early in the morning. They're sedated. We bring them to the veterinary clinic with the students. We take blood samples, all these kind of things, fit the radio collar, and then wait for the whole day to go by so that the anesthesia wears off, and then release her. Here's something I want to bring up to you. Here's some video footage of a coyote-cat interaction. This was from 7 years ago. And this is one of our radio-collared coyotes, and here's a cat. Not necessarily the world's brightest cat. Cat's grooming itself. Coyote's going, this is interesting. Ears up. A little bit concerned. Look, this ear's going back. That's a signal. This is not a coyote that's saying, oh, there's dinner. This is a coyote going, I'm not sure. I've seen these guys. I don't really know. I'm going to come a little bit closer.
And wait.
Very interested in what it's seeing.
Those big ears have a characteristic.
Yes, yes. See, people, when they see coyotes, they think they're much bigger than they are because their legs are so long and their ears are so big. They're really scrawny things.
They are.
Cat's still cleaning itself.
Oh
Oh.
my God. Okay, now all right.
Now it's getting interesting. This is a classic felid response,
Sure.
making itself look bigger.
So much for dinner.
Oh, that cat is either dumb or brave, I don't know.
Oh, wait.
Well, no, there it looked like the coyote realized the
Cut the
camera was
camera,
up.
yeah.
Right.
It's heard the whirring of the camera motor.
Yeah.
So it doesn't even, now it's, is it more afraid of the cat or is it more afraid of the camera?
Camera. Not looking back at the
Look at the
cat.
different pelage, the white and the gray. You're going to see this animal later when it's an adult. When it's
How
more,
old is it?
about 2 years at this point.
He's probably wondering whether you're going to pay him royalties.
Yeah.
I can't believe this.
The cat is driving the coyote away. And in a moment, you'll see the cat start to chase the coyote into the woods.
Oh, for God's sake.
So not all coyote-cat encounters end up, look, the cat, fur's still up on the cat, tail swishing.
Yeah,
I'm going to go after this damn coyote. Yeah.
Easy to be brave when already the coyote's in retreat.
Right.
Where was this taken?
This is down on Cape Cod.
Oh.
Here are pups from one of the dens. This is a natural den. And these pups are about between 8 and 10 weeks.
What do they eat?
The parents will bring anything from roadkills to squirrels to mice, rabbits.
What's the interaction with them and Red Fox?
Very little. They try and the red foxes will just do just about anything to avoid a coyote.
Are they in the city as well?
Yes. But red foxes weigh less than a cat. You know, foxes weigh about 9 pounds. Your cat weighs 15, and so a red fox is a better prey item than a cat. That's a dominance move that that animal's doing. It's called a cover position. And those early interactions end up being really important. This is a coyote that we just captured or about to anesthetize. I want to just show you this last piece here. Here are the pups that we hand-reared from a nuisance den in Falmouth. They dug them out and they were going to gas them, and we arranged for the Stone Zoo to accept them when they were old enough to go to the zoo, so we raised them by hand for the first few months.
A nuisance.
Nuisance den. It was a den under somebody's deck.
Oh.
So, there you go. A little bit of information on urban ecology, a little bit on what we do as scientists.
Could you put the last slide back up with the web page?
I can, I will do that very thing.
And while he's doing that, we're open for questions and discussion.
Did you say earlier that the population density in cities of coyotes is greater than it is?
It's a great question. What I did, and you were close, what I said is that the territory sizes of coyotes in cities tend to be smaller. The question of how many coyotes there are, as long as we've been studying them, we're feeling less and less confident about actually calling out a number. Because when the coyotes that are visible to folks are usually the ones that are dispersing. And so, for instance, that coyote that dispersed from Boston to Rhode Island would have walked through many, many neighborhoods and would have been counted as a resident coyote in any neighborhood it walked through. So we do know that the territory sizes are smaller in urban areas, which means there's a potential for higher density. But what we don't have a good handle on yet is reproductive success. You know, that study needs to go on 15 years because we need to know, what happens to the pups, what happens to the grandpups, how many generations. We need to see 2 or 3 generations of life cycle to understand whether cities actually produce more coyotes or whether cities might be magnets for coyotes because of resources available. The reason I asked that, I put it in that context, is that our lab also does research with crows. And it turns out that cities end up having very high densities of crows, but crows don't generally have very high reproductive success in cities. So cities end up being recruitment areas for crows. They'll be here in those large roosts, but then they tend to disperse back out as breeders. Yeah.
Is your Urban NCO website up and running?
Yes. Did you try and click on it? It didn't come up?
Yeah.
And you got this weird...
This domain has just been registered?
Yes, what we did, and would happen today, wouldn't it? We just switched servers.
Okay.
We're no longer using the BC server to provide these resources. So if you click on it tomorrow, it'll be back.
Sure.
I know I clicked on it this afternoon. The first thing I thought is, okay, what have I done wrong? Because we've had the same location for years, but we just hired a firm about 6 months ago to completely redo our website, and we must be going live with it tomorrow. That must be what's going on.
Yeah, it can take up to 7 years. No problem.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
This particular shot, was that taken on the part of the MBTA that goes from Ashmont to Mattapan?
You got it. It's like the only public transportation line that runs to a cemetery. It's beautiful. It's this looks incredibly rural, but yet it's right in Boston. This is one of the vent systems for the main water supply for the city of Boston, and there's a red-tailed hawk female sitting right on top of there. But you're right. That's between Ashmont and Mattapan. Yep, that's right in South Boston in the big marsh system.
Another question, if you're walking in the western woods and you meet a little critter, like a coyote, and you're by yourself, and you're carrying a stick, you're okay?
I think you're okay under any condition. Now, if the animal's rabid, then you may have a challenge, but chances are you're going to recognize some very strange behavior. In general, people tend to consider coyotes more of a risk because coyotes are so curious. And people have reported being stalked by coyotes. And what's really happening is a coyote's just following you because it's interested, and chances are you're going to drop some food. So there's a big difference between having an animal that's staying 20 meters away and one that's actually preparing for an attack. And we deal so seldomly with wild animals that we have a sense whenever we're in the presence of a wild animal that we're at high risk.
And they don't come in packs?
They'll come in family groups. And in fact, the howling that you hear, when you hear howling at night, that tends to be adults returning, and that's the greeting signals that they do with the young. That's their celebration, that's their jubilation. Yeah, in the back.
Well, just on what coyotes will do, last winter, coyotes took down a deer near my house.
During the winter?
Late winter, early spring. But they took it right down on the driveway.
Was it during, was the deer yarded up because of snow, or
I don't think so.
was it a young deer?
The deer was taken away by the time I.
Interesting.
Taken away.
We're hoping that coyotes will have a positive influence in regulating deer population. Another project our group works in is in the Lyme disease system. And one of the reasons these zoonotic diseases are at such high risk in these suburban areas is that we've removed all of our top order predators. You know, an area like Weston 150 years ago would have had mountain lions, or catamounts as you call them here. They would have brown bears or black bears. They would have had wolves, and they probably had fishers and martens.
Still have fishes.
Yep, we catch fishers in our traps. I was about to say that fisher's about the only thing you've got left that'll take a medium-sized mammal, and certainly, you know, fishers aren't much of a risk to deer.
One other quick question.
Sure.
Early on, you showed two slides with the change in density for Philadelphia and Washington.
Washington, Baltimore, yeah.
What's the resource for those slides?
Those are U.S. Geologic Survey, I'm pretty sure, yeah. I think those are government data, and if you send me an email, I'll find out for you and send it back. Yeah.
I can understand why the tree planting and so on relates to the science for revitalizing American cities, but where do the coyotes come in? Are you going to put more coyotes in there?
No, it's not an issue, and that's a great question, and because we're trying to cover too much in too little time, I didn't build that part of the story as well. I think that having a deep understanding of wildlife in urban areas is going to help us in general manage our cities better. Because one of the responses that humans tend to have in urbanized areas to wildlife is to figure out strategies to get rid of them. And I think there's an intermediate position with respect to management of these species. Because we know that in certain areas, when coyotes move in, they do have an impact on wild cat populations or feral cat populations. And as you reduce feral cat populations, you bring up ground nesting bird populations. And as you bring up ground nesting bird populations, you increase the predatory threat to insects, which can, in effect, lower human risk to zoonotic disease.
How does it relate to rats?
Coyotes will certainly eat rats if they can get them.
And so will feral cats.
Yeah, but feral cats, you know, rats and a cat can be can be a pretty equal undertaking. Yeah.
Could, if it's true then that these coyotes are living in urban areas and they do eat rats and mice like that, is it possible that you would work with the rodent control agencies in the city to have protected little homes for the coyotes, since they would be able to get them back?
Well, I would hope we would come to a point where we would consider coyotes and other larger fauna as urban resources. And we would provide protected areas for them, because I think on balance their impact is positive. And whether it's removal of rats or ultimately reduction in zoonotic disease risk, I think you're always going to have what we call rogue animals that have to be managed individually and may have to be removed from systems. But, you know, I forward the thesis that they have been persecuting coyotes for 150 years in the American West, and there are no fewer coyotes. You know, they're incredibly good at out-reproducing our ability to poison, shoot, trap, and remove them. Although I will say that 3 of the radio-collared coyotes that we captured and released north of Boston, associated with Revere High School, the Revere High School project, were poisoned by people who knew their whereabouts. So.
An immense educational effort.
It is an immense educational effort, and we're starting with one of the most complicated animals, and I think that makes sense. Let's start with the ones that cause the most concern within a community. And in some respects, it means giving up some of our, you know, sort of Disney-esque ideas about animals, but we can also capture a more realistic view of what the ecological services are of the wildlands and wild creatures that we have in urban areas.
Are you also studying deer? That's probably the chief concern both ways.
Well, certainly in suburban areas, the impact of deer are extraordinary, and there are no top order predators for the most part, and because of the density of housing, is too high, you don't have traditional forms of harvesting. Now, the township of Princeton a few years ago, it got so bad there where they were having as many as 300 car deer strikes per year. And by the way, there are, yeah, they started to harvest deer with bow and arrow right downtown. You know, they had tree stands put onto the power lines, the power line poles.
Weston, there's an area up here, where it's posted as being a hunting area.
Yeah. Nationwide, there's nearly 300,000 deer automobile strikes per year that kill about 800 people a year. So the most dangerous wildlife in America are white-tailed deer. But it's always related to a deer car strike. Yeah.
Are you finding that, or is it too soon to tell, these kids, you're introducing them into environmental and ecological, concerns and taking care of things. Are you finding that they're starting to turn towards science as far as beyond high school?
Yeah, we have additional programs that we've started, like the Leah Mentors program, which is a funded program for these students who graduate from this program to become mentors to younger students. We have a program called Green Times, where we have high school students writing ecological stories for middle school students, and that publication's reaching about 30,000 students across Massachusetts. The real challenge in these things, as with any of these programs, is tracking your alumni. You know, especially some of these kids are from very poor neighborhoods and families that move a lot. In the Boston Public Schools, there's 40% turnover in students from the time a student enters as a freshman and leaves as a senior. So the probability that a student will even be in the same school is only 50%. And so it's forced us, in the first schools we were working in, we developed these intricate 4-year programs, which we still have. But what we really need are modules that can be taught in 2 weeks and 4 weeks, because we may only get the student for half a year before they move to another school, or the family has them moving to another city. Yeah.
Seeing the red-tailed hawk there reminds me, excuse me, I used to live in the South End for a number
Oh,
of years,
wonderful.
and I walked in the Franklin Square
Yep.
area, and one afternoon, I was there, and all of a sudden, all the pigeons were very quiet. I looked, and there was a hawk that had gotten hold of one of them, and it was having a lunch.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just wondering, is that an indication of future directions of your project in terms of the cost of creating?
Funny you should mention that, because we had recently gotten some funding to purchase these web-based cameras that we can mount in bird nests. And we've done that down in Barnstable High School, where a colleague of mine, Pete Auger, who now teaches with us here at Boston College, has been doing studies of osprey. And I think there's a great opportunity to study raptors in urban areas. If we had a little more time tonight, we would have done the story of Pale Male, the red-tailed hawk in New York City that caused such a stir. Be real cause celeb, because of here's this beautiful hawk that's living right downtown Manhattan. And these are important top-order predators, and peregrine falcons, red-tailed hawks, and other raptors can actually do pretty well in urban areas if you just give them the critical thing they need, which is usually nest box space that's protected. And so church spires, university spires, we have 4 or 5 different species of hawks that are nesting on campus at Boston College, and most people never see them. But if you're the buildings and grounds person and you have to clean out the nests once a year, you know where they are. But they're generally low impact on the community, but important players in the ecological stage play.
We used to have bats at Regis, and when I teach in the summer, the night class, when it would get later and darker, and I thought to myself, boy, those birds are up late.
Bats are wonderful.
Well, and then I realized they were bats. Well, some of the students started flipping out. Bats, I'm not leaving. Oh my God, my hair.
Oh, bats are everywhere. Bats all
I
over the
said, "Yeah,
campus,
even
and yeah.
mosquitoes,
Oh yeah.
just be glad for it."
Yeah, if one of the great sort of ecological services you can have is to have a bat colony in your home, and you can build bat boxes so that you can attract them, because you don't necessarily want them in your attic, because they can be problematic. But the number of insects that they eat, we have bat studies we're doing on the Cape, and we're working on how to bring those into the urban area. Students are recording the bat calls, and they jam each other's signals. I mean, just incredibly fascinating animals in their ability to hunt and navigate. Yeah.
Is anyone studying the red foxes in the greater Boston
No one particular, and I think it's a fascinating question because the anecdotal evidence suggests that their populations are declining and may very well be declining. They had been declining in the late 80s to the mid 90s because of a serious outbreak of sarcoptic mange, which in humans is called scabies. It's the same. As someone who works with canids, who has managed to catch that, I had to learn that. And in fact, it was my veterinarian that diagnosed that I had it, not my, not my GP, because he'd never seen anyone who,
Not on humans.
no, had never had scabies. She said, "You've got mange."
I think that
So the fox population clearly declined in the 90s because of that, then recovered, and we're not really sure whether the population's ever going to recover to its original numbers. But then what were those numbers like? Because red foxes are not native to this area. They displaced the gray foxes. The red foxes were brought here as for sport hunting and that type of thing from Europe. So we don't really know, and that would be a great set of questions because they play a very important.
They're far less afraid of humans than coyotes are.
That's right. That's right. Because the stock they were brought from in Europe, there's no place in England that you're not watching a human being if you're an animal. I mean, if you're a non-human animal, But coyotes are for the most part pretty wary of people, and they keep their distance. But the foxes are so bold. We have a fox that comes in the morning and sits in our backyard, and the dogs are lunging at the window, and the fox is looking like, "That door's closed. I'm not worried."
There was a family of fox that was living in a field near my home and down the end, and for about 6 years they were there.
Wow.
You go down in the springtime and you can just stand there and watch the kids play.
Oh, that's wonderful.
The funniest thing was watching the mother pick up the dead squirrel and follow the kids around and try to drop it in front of them. They'd ignore it.
Right.
They weren't ready for hard meat yet.
They weren't, but she was ready for them to be ready for, yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
I think that some of those foxes found the rabbit hole in my backyard this summer. I don't think I have rabbits anymore, which is unfortunate.
Yes, sir.
Is your tree planting continuing in Boston?
Yes. Yes, we'll be doing that, in the foreseeable future. We have funding for the next couple of years. We're moving the counting program to other cities. Cambridge doesn't know how many trees they have. Brookline still hasn't counted all of their trees. And getting a count is just sort of the first step in beginning a transformation with respect to how the city views trees. Yeah.
When you do the tree counting, you count where a tree could go? Let's say you have a road, and on one particular piece of that road, there obviously were other trees there, and they're gone.
Those would be the empty tree pits. When I mentioned that there were a certain number of empty pits, those were sites in which trees had been planned or had been previously planted. A tree's lifespan in the city is a little bit less than it would be in other areas. It's about 30 years. Normally you think of a tree as about a 40 years lifespan. And in the city, they last about 30 years. So a city like Boston that's had, extensive urban planning may have had 3 or 4 trees in a given tree pit.
So does this, if I may,
Sure.
become evidence for you to present to the tree responsibility people?
Absolutely.
The city and say, now look, can you, budget X amount of money?
That's right. And Jim Hunt, who is the lead environmentalist for Mayor Menino's staff, was instrumental in getting this Greater Boston Urban Forest Coalition the kind of permits it needed to be gathering these data. And this next year is the year of the environment for the city of Boston, and Mayor Menino has put at the top of his agenda the regreening of Boston. And it was just last month that the city of Boston hosted the Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai, the African woman scientist who helped to plant over 1 million trees in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a wonderful night of celebration at Quincy Market, where she came and talked, and the mayor was there, and he made this pledge to commit to additional tree planting. Because it's such a cost-effective intervention. It's a politically neutral, cost-effective way of improving the environmental health of your community. There's such little downside if you plant the right species of trees. Yeah.
That actually leads to my question. Do you know if they're doing any of this work in cities like
Yes, other cities, in fact, among leaders in Africa with help from the World Health Organization and Agency for International Development to plant hundreds of millions of trees in Africa because it just has such an enormous impact. And so many of the communities are dependent on trees not just for their cleansing and cultural capacity, but literally for the tree products that they produce. And you know, the famines in the African continent have resulted in people spending about a century and a half denuding Africa without replanting the trees.